This is The Strange Recital, a podcast about fiction which questions the nature of reality. When the bombing started, J.T. Carter was deep in the bowels of a bank in Baltimore with a video camera on his shoulder, capturing cinema verité, the mundane fate of everyone's rent check. Machine clatter filling his ears, he stared through the lens at a shuffling deck of personal checks, a non-stop riffling flow like the first flourish of a magician's card trick, but without end and performed by fingerless giants built of plastic and steel. Across the room, the girl running the damaged item sorter removed her radio earphones and announced over the rushing roar of a river of money, "Bush done it. He's whooping 'em." J.T. never took his eye from the viewfinder, just zoomed in a little tighter on the beautiful leafy flutter of paper in the grip of the rattling machine. Later, at dinner with the video crew at a Hungarian restaurant, J.T. observed as if from outside his body as Gloria, the brunette actress who played the bank's spokeswoman, flirted overtly with him. It was more than just the joking camaraderie that had grown between them during the day. At dessert, she stood behind him and rubbed his shoulders and neck. He stared at the tablecloth, enjoying her touch, but embarrassed. Meanwhile, the waiter, a lugubrious but talkative Eastern European, told in his thick accent, wide-eyed with fear, about his younger brother who was in the U.S. Army somewhere near Kuwait. The crew sat silent or fidgeting. J.T. hadn't had sex in nearly 2 years. This was January. His divorce had been final last June, after a year of bruising court battles and depressed waiting. For months before that, there had been nothing between him and his wife. No kissing, no touching, almost no speaking. Now he was bitterly lonely. In many ways, his life was great. He enjoyed his work as never before, after making a career change a year previous. He had left a corporate accounting job to tackle the world of freelance photography, both still and video. He had even revised his identity. He was no longer Jeff, short for Jefferson, T for Thaddeus, Carter, named for stern ancestors in sepia photos. J.T. looked so much better on his new business cards, and he liked how it sounded in the mouths of art directors and communications managers, his clients. After 6 months of struggle, the new venture had finally begun to pay his bills, as long as he lived modestly. He felt he had found a sort of balance, but he still lived alone in a tiny drab apartment and had no social life except with his kids, daughter 6, son 4, fun but not exactly socially fulfilling. He was desperate to be caressed. Also, there was a truth that J.T. was embarrassed about. He had never had sex with anyone but his ex-wife. Back home in rural Utah, in a family of faithful Mormons, that's what was expected. Marry young as virgins, then be monogamous forever. For all of eternity. Even after he'd left that religion behind, come to live in the capital of worldliness, New York City, and wound up single, still his experience with any other woman's body was limited to the occasional magazine and masturbatory fantasy. He wanted that situation to change. A few weeks earlier, on a shoot in Fort Lauderdale, he'd gone alone to a strip club and dropped $100 on sodas for a blonde with a Dutch accent and muscular thighs, watching her dance naked on his table. Later, she'd met him in a coffee shop, told him all about her life, then walked away, leaving him with nothing to do but watch the sunrise on the beach until time for his flight back to New York. So, after dinner, when Gloria whispered in his ear, "Come to my room," he knew he would go. She was no more than a new acquaintance with whom he had little in common, but he knew he would go. 2 hours later, he hung in a tilting limbo, at once both pleasured and split. They had turned on the hotel TV, war news on all channels. They had chatted, kissed, were suddenly naked on the bed, his fingertips on her skin like latte silk, exquisite, smelling fresh from a shower. Her nipples were large and dark, and he thought of gulping rich, sweet coffee. Nothing like his ex-wife's, those sips of pale rose tea. And on TV, Desert Storm was in full swing. Who inhabited his body doing this? Not himself. Not himself. How could such opposites coexist? Fresh-faced news anchors praising with pride the capabilities of America's smart Patriot missiles, intelligent target-seeking, pinpoint accuracy, and gravely condescending to those pathetic Iraqi scuds, and the screen showing explosions in cheery green with a video camera frame like a cross between home movies and Nintendo, and casualties counting up on candy-colored bar charts like votes, and the sound of war as entertainment blaring on and on and on. And yet here was a man, surely just a generic man, nameless, without history, a silly man, making urgent, fumbling love to a stranger in a hotel room in Baltimore. How could anything be real? They didn't speak. Her eyes stayed closed. Afterward, they shut the TV off and in the blessed silence remembered the fun they had had working together. He was glad they could return to that and shut everything else out. She clowned, miming the producer's imaginary shocked reaction to this illicit employee rendezvous. They laughed a lot, then it was a quick kiss and an exaggerated play of stealth as he snuck out of her room to go back to his own and sleep. The next morning, JT said goodbye to Gloria and the rest of the video crew as they left for New York. He felt raw, as if his skin had been scraped, and he didn't know how to speak to anyone, especially her. What did it mean? A new relationship? Another tour of duty in the battle zone of love? No? Then why not? He feared he'd been a disappointment the night before, yet she seemed to like him a lot, and there was no doubt he had enjoyed her body. She was pretty and fun. He liked her. But she hadn't spoken her feelings. What do New Yorkers do? He wasn't one yet, not really. He was a Utah boy, and back in that world there is no such thing as casual sex. Sex is a sacred manifestation of eternal love, or, if not that, at least genuine relationship. Was he ready for that? Again? Or was this all just too dangerous? He covered his turmoil with smiles and a stolen twinkle of eye contact with her, and the crew drove away. In that tiny glance was an agreement. Yes, he'd be seeing her again, and his heart did a little happy dance. Even so, now he was relieved to be alone to follow his plan. Drive an hour to Washington, D.C., see the Paul Strand photography exhibit at the National Gallery, submerge himself in images, be simple, learn something real. Strand was one of the mythic figures, the early giants of photography as a fine art, a pioneer from the days when the world must have been black and white. JT wandered as if in a meditation through the hushed, empty gallery rooms, where each warm-toned monochrome print hung in its own spotlight. Some were abstracts of form and line, shadow and light, close-up studies of everyday objects that turned them to classical architecture. Others were street portraits, faces of the rugged, the weathered, the poor, the workers of the world, images driven by the leftist politics that led Strand to become an expatriate at the dawn of the McCarthy era. JT loved the fact that Strand had invented a sideways shooting camera that could appear to be focused in one direction while shooting another, allowing him to capture his subject unaware, unposed, authentic. And he had pioneered documentary filmmaking as well. A man who crossed genres, linked across time and kinship with JT, or with JT's dreams of himself. Hours passed. It felt to JT as if he were in a temple, his own private worship space, and he was fully immersed in seeing, thinking, absorbing into his body the perfect stillness and silence, the form, line, tone, and wordless meanings of the images. Eventually he was full and made his way out of the Strand show into the huge vaulted lobby of the National Gallery, and then out through the glass doors into the bright winter sunshine. He walked from quiet into chaos. It had not occurred to him that the mall would be crowded, packed from the Washington Monument to the Capitol with demonstrators, a noisy, colorful maelstrom, a circus of political viewpoints, people shouting, singing, handing out buttons and flyers, a whole gamut of ideologies, from the yellow ribbon crusaders to those who demanded we assassinate Bush and spare poor Saddam. Vietnam vets, tie-dyed teenagers, spiky punks, frisbees and dogs and 12-foot puppets on parade, music everywhere, and under it all a vibration of desperate anger, violence barely in check, hatred under the sun, in a scene like some upside-down Woodstock. J.T. stood stunned for a moment as if on the bank of a raging river. Then he grabbed the camera dangling from his neck and plunged in. For a half hour he operated on instinct and adrenaline, grabbing pictures through his wide angle as the moments presented themselves, squinting, crouching, this way, that, everything on the fly, humans of every sort flowing in a loud, spastic current over him, then gone. But his energy couldn't last. Something bubbled up from his heart, and he suddenly stopped amidst the shouts and songs and anger. Images of his children in his head, along with utter bewilderment. How could it be that in 20 years America had come no further than this? How could we have learned nothing at all from the horror of Vietnam? The whole scene was insane, impossible, a terrible recurring nightmare from which there was no escape. He fled. Driving up 95 toward home, JT's thoughts were a jumble. Still, silvery forms bathed in spectral light. Angry faces, wild motion, and blaring sound. Dreamlike memories of the night before, Gloria's skin, hair, laughter, the sweetness of touching. Explosions, bullet tracers in night vision green. A blind beggar's face in crisp sepia. Swirling flags, red, white, blue, peace chants, and violent gestures. Deep, long kisses. Something big was happening to him. What did it all mean? His throat too full, he switched on the radio. A mistake. Nothing but dull reportage of death and atrocities in monotone voices droning on. That was when, glazed eyes on the road, he slipped into the past. I am running down a rutted mountain road, endlessly running and shouting, "Help! Help! My dad is hurt!" It is summer, 1973, and I am 11 years old, helping my dad with the sheep up on Boulder Mountain like I do every year. He's only 42, despite his craggy face like an old photograph and his limp from a sniper's bullet. We are in the meadow near the camp wagon, and he has suddenly fallen to the ground, grabbing his left arm, moaning, eyes rolled up, pupils invisible. He won't talk to me. I can't pick him up. I don't know what to do. I just run and cry and yell. My dad is a strong man, a farmer, a veteran of the Korean War, a survivor of the useless slaughter at Pork Chop Hill. A man with strong opinions but very few words. After a hard day's work and a silent dinner, he would sit and watch the 10 o'clock news, a scary dark frown on his brow, and mutter, "Goddamn bastards," over and over. But I knew he wasn't talking about the Viet Cong. He was talking about the generals and politicians and corporate bosses getting rich, while young men bled and died in the muddy jungles. He didn't care much for hippies and their protests, but he cared even less about military pride. When we pulled out of the war that spring, he grunted and nodded at the TV, as happy as I'd ever seen him. I stumble and fall, scraping my palms on stones. I get up and run. I run until I think my heart and lungs will burst out of my chest. Then I walk a little while, then I run again. When I get to the ranger station, it's almost sunset. My breath is hoarse. I can barely walk or talk, but I say what I need to. As we race in his Jeep back up the bumpy road to the sheep camp, I struggle to keep from sobbing. I know we're too late. I knew it all along. I had heard the terrible groans from deep in my father's chest, and then I had seen his lip quiver and heard him moan like a little child. And I had heard that last thing, a small, mournful sigh that said all hope was forever gone, and then the words, "Oh no, not another war." JT twitched, swerved, stomped on the brake as a carload of teenagers careened around him, cut him off by inches, loud music thumping, and sped off down an exit ramp. A hand out the window flipped him the finger. They were yelling, laughing, kids having fun. Eyes suddenly blurry, he wrestled his car to a skidding stop on the side of the highway, heart thumping from the nearness of death. Those teens were who he'd been way back when. They were what his children would soon become. How many in that car would die in a foreign desert for nothing? Were his children facing a future of bleak struggle, of poisoned water, brown air, endless war? He switched off the radio and leaned his head on the steering wheel, trying to stop his thoughts, to think about nothing but the beauty of art and the imminent possibility of new love, until finally his shaking hands grew calm. He wiped the tears from his eyes and looked up. The road ahead was empty. He put his car in gear, checked his mirrors, and stepped on the gas.
That was Another War, written and read by Brent Robison. This story is an excerpt of the novel A Book with No Author by Brent Robison, Recital Publishing, 2023. This is the third episode we've done now, featuring excerpts from your novel, A Book with No Author. As we've discussed, the novel is a book within a book, or even a book within a book within a book. Quite a recursive construct. So, where or how does this excerpt fit in with it all?
I should probably mention that Another War was originally published in an online literary magazine called Two Cities Review back in 2014. So it was a standalone story long before the novel was published, and maybe it was part of the genesis of the novel. It appears over halfway through the book and functions on two levels. It deepens our understanding of the protagonist and his backstory, while also being an artifact of the primary mystery in the book, which is, who is the author? The story is published in a journal, but how could someone know enough personal details about the protagonist to write it?
Well, Another War seems to be quite a self-contained story. What do you think the difference is between the role of standalone stories in novels as opposed to in short story collections?
Well, there is that sort of amorphous category called a novel in stories, which is more than a standard collection of unrelated stories, but instead actually builds a plot line as the stories proceed, with characters and settings recurring, etc. My novel's not exactly in either category. 10 of its chapters, scattered in a seemingly random way throughout the book, are conceived as standalone pieces of writing, Most of these provide not only plot and character development like any chapter would, but are also structural plot elements in themselves, as their inexplicable existence is essentially the engine of the plot. And I should mention that those stories are inside a manuscript that is itself the same kind of mysterious object without an origin. Who and where is the author?
Yeah, where indeed. Now, in these nested stories, are you writing about the same character using different names? And if so, why?
Yeah, I wanted to play with several levels of meta. Using stories as artifacts of the plot makes it essentially fiction about fiction. And then I go further by altering the name of the main character in these different stories, while keeping it similar, but also using life details that show it's the same person. The protagonist, A.J. Campbell, becomes J.T. Carter in the story we just heard. But we learn near the end of the book that A.J. Campbell is based on a real guy named C.J. Angus. Even the apparent author of these stories changes his name more than once. Names seem to echo each other throughout the book, and a similarity of names is how the mystery manuscript lands in the narrator's hands in the first place, and the narrator happens to have my name. So all this is to explore the fluidity of identity and of authorship. Is one's name an essential part of the self, or a random attachment? What is a self, anyway? And who owns its story?
Better ask the ancient Egyptians. Well, what inspired you to use this recursive technique for your novel? Was it any particular book you read, or any particular author that gave you the idea? Or is it just in your DNA?
Well, my favorite kind of books to read are the ones that are both metafictional and metaphysical. I can't think of any one book that inspired this novel, but I'm a fan of Nabokov, Borges, Auster, Citizen Kane in The Hall of Mirrors, the dream scene in Wild Strawberries, Blow Up, The Conversation. I'm fascinated by illusion, hoaxes, masks, the unreliability of memory and even of perception. Maybe it's in my DNA to be always wondering stuff like, what exactly do I mean when I say I? Doesn't it sometimes seem that our so-called real lives have been written elsewhere? What if everything we've been taught is wrong? What's really going on behind appearances?
Well, Another War is presented in a very realistic way. JT's doubts, hopes, aspirations, his work and his interests, his emotional state, all feel natural. This realism perhaps runs counter to the Russian doll concept of the book as a whole. So was this deliberate, or did it just unfold subconsciously?
Long ago, it was instinctual, but gradually I became aware of what I was really doing with my writing, which is to create an analog of real life as I experience it. So now that juxtaposition is deliberate. What I mean is that we live in a gritty reality full of mundane tasks punctuated by joys and tragedies, but at the same time, we carry an ineffable sense of something bigger, deeper going on in invisible realms. At least that's the way I see it. So in my writing, I want to capture everyday human reality, but put it in a framework of sort of cosmic mystery, a universe of exquisite fractal patterns and complex beauty. To quote Chrissy Hind, quoting Oscar Wilde, we're all in the gutter, but some of us are looking at the stars.
Your description of JT as a boy, running to save his father, is very powerful, gut-wrenching in fact. Were you drawing from your own memories? Or is this a question I shouldn't be asking?
I'm not so sure. I want to honor the experience of a cousin of mine who I'm not really in touch with, who went through something like this at the death of his father, my dad's oldest brother.
Mm-hmm.
It was an intense and sad story that reverberated through my childhood that I never forgot.
Yeah.
Of course, this scene was just my attempt to imagine what he might have gone through.
I've been reading The Case Against Reality by the physicist Donald Hoffman. It's an explanation of his theory of reality for laymen. My understanding of it is that he's saying that there is such a thing as objective reality, but it's not the reality we perceive with our senses. What we think of as objective reality is what he describes as an interface, a version of reality that allows us to survive and negotiate the world. He uses the metaphor of folder icons on a computer screen. They're not real folders, but allow us to get and store information without having to calculate the flow of electricity through integrated circuits, which wouldn't be an easy task with our senses. What we think of as objective reality has that same function.
Yeah, I read Hoffman's book too a few months back, or most of it. Toward the end, I decided I understood his point and didn't need any more dense detail. You're taking quite a tangent here, but I like it.
Yeah, I know. It sounds like I'm digressing, but I have a point if you'll bear with me. There's a section of the book where Hoffman talks about the physicist John Wheeler and his delayed choice variation of the famous 1927 double slit experiment, where single photons were fired at a photographic plate, but had to pass through a screen with two slits in it first. Sometimes they'd pass through slit A, sometimes through slit B, and sometimes seemingly through both at the same time. In Hoffman's words, Wheeler's delayed choice variation on this experiment is clever. Wait until after the photon passes the metal screen, and only then decide what to measure. What we choose to measure after the photon has passed the screen determines what the photon did, or at least what we can say about what it did, before we measured. The past depends on our choice in the present.
Yeah.
I think that casts a different light on biography, autobiography, and memory in fiction. There's truth in fiction, it's just not necessarily what's expected, and depends upon the way it's written or read.
The past depends on our choice in the present. That makes me think of block universe theory, also called eternalism, which says that all time exists simultaneously, which can explain precognition and coincidence. Good stuff for stories.
Yeah, certainly. I think you could make an analogy between those quantum experiments and fiction, where the book is the experiment, the writing is the measurement, and the author is the observer. That might be another way to look at your novel, A Book with No Author. It's a quantum experiment. Perhaps I just answered my own question.
Yes.
And then, what about that Dr. Seuss story of the watchers watching the watchers who are watching the watcher who's watching the bee? That sounds like a quantum experiment.
That's one I don't remember, but it points toward the same thing in each of us. What is human consciousness if not thinking about thinking? An inner observer always aware of being aware. Life is like metafiction.
Yeah, but of course, this might be an example of what Socrates didn't like about literacy. He felt it enabled people who didn't think deeply to waffle on about ideas they knew nothing about.
Waffling on is fun.
And so it is. But back to your story. You've mentioned writing a sequel to this book. The futures of JT or CJ or BR or however they're named. Is that in the works? Or is it a superposition?
Yes, the sequel already exists as time is simultaneous. Or it exists as a probability wave right now. Perhaps it will collapse into particulate matter once I measure it, which is to say, write it. But Yes, C.J. Angus has a pretty big story to tell as he takes on the pursuit of the missing author who's stolen his life. Maybe it's sufficient for this story to remain in my mind only. Who knows if I'll ever write again? Too busy with so-called reality.
Well, I know you've recently put considerable time and effort into researching and tracing back the ownership of the land upon which your house is situated, and you've put together a talk and presentation about it. Can you say more about that?
Yes, I have the chain of title all the way back to the Native Americans.
Wow.
My wife and I had a great time doing the research, and I was surprised by how it deepened my love of these Catskill Mountains we live in.
Yeah.
We built an educational PowerPoint slideshow that we'll be presenting around the region in the coming months. But now that we've properly digressed, shall we start again at the beginning?
Okay, why not? Here we go again. This is the third episode we've done now, featuring excerpts from your novel, A Book with No Author. As we've discussed, the novel is a book within a book, or even a book within a book. This is The Strange Recital, on the web at thestrangerecital.com. The music on this episode was from Hearing Voices by John Shoemaker. This episode is 25051.